All right, everybody, welcome back to Section 2 of Comparative Criminology. As always, I'm Dr. Kevin W. Jennings, and I really appreciate you watching. Now, within comparative research, one of the things comparative research wants to do is classification, right? We want to take all the different units that we can see, in this case, criminal justice systems, or policing systems, or legal systems, and put them into categories, right? So of the 200 plus countries in the world, there's type A, type B, and type C. The famous times that science has done this, obviously there's Linnaeus, who categorized humans, Linnaeus categorized living things across the planet. And he's the one that gave us the system that I'm sure most people learned in middle school or high school about, what is it, kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. He's the one that developed that classification system for all. The intention was to create it for all living things on the planet, and obviously it's much different now than it was when he first made it. Another famous example from science is the periodic table, right? Everything can be broken down into atoms. One proton, one electron, that's hydrogen. Then two protons, two electrons, that's a different element. Helium in this case, and we categorize all those things into nice groupings, and we come up with the periodic table of the elements, right? And even that's not unchanging. We've added a few onto the end since the periodic table was first developed. But in criminal justice and in comparative criminal justice, we want to do this as well. So one of the big ways that we categorize criminal justice systems is I'm not sure if there's a name for the overarching concept here, but the examples of categories are the common law or adversarial systems, which is what we in the United States and the United Kingdom will be familiar with. And it's very common in areas of the world that were British colonies at one point. So the United States, Australia, I believe India, but don't quote me on that. Those kind of areas. If your country used to be colonized by the British, chances are they have a common law or adversarial system. The civil law or inquisitorial system started in France. And then, of course, France conquered most of Europe during the Napoleonic era and gave most of Europe their civil law or inquisitorial system. And then France and many of those other countries that had developed the French system or adopted the French system made their own colonies and went out into the world and gave them their civil law or inquisitorial system. Then, of course, there's the socialist system, which essentially started with the USSR and countries that were either colonized by them or were former member states or were allied with them might have a socialist system. And this one's getting much more rare. Most of the countries that are no longer, used to be Soviet states but no longer are, have changed to either civil law or a common law system, but there's still usually elements of the old socialist system still in place. And there are still a few countries that use a more socialist style system, Cuba, North Korea, that kind of thing. And then there are the religious justice systems, famously the Islamic ones, Sharia law, which is either part of or kind of essentially most of or the entire justice system in a few countries, especially in the Middle East. But we've taken all these different criminal justice systems and tried to categorize them. And, I read out this section of categories as if every country in the world fits nicely and neatly into one of those four systems. But they don't. There's a lot of diversity, even looking at just, say, common law systems. Those are the ones that I'm most familiar with, being an American. And just looking at common law systems, there's a vast difference between the common law justice systems of the United States and Canada and the UK and Australia. Even though those all are in the same category according to this, they're still very, very different. And there are aspects of other things that have entered into each one. For instance, Japan. Japan has a very blended common law and inquisitorial system. When they first kind of went out and started engaging with the West in the 18th and 19th centuries, I guess just the 19th century. I don't remember my Japanese history that well, but it's somewhere in there. They started engaging with the West and essentially adopted an inquisitorial civil law system from France. But then, of course, World War II happened, and the United States occupied them for a long time, was able to have a lot of important changes on their government and legal system, introducing aspects of common law. So now there's a ton of aspects of the Japanese legal system from each of those two different categories. So there's no country in the world that has a pure system of just one of these four. They're all kind of mixed and different. And when we categorize like this, one of the dangers is that we're going to destroy kind of the diversity in thought and the diversity in method between different countries or even different regions of a country, even if they might share this very simplistic kind of category. So it's useful, but don't take it to mean everything. Now, who does comparative research, right? There are lots of different kinds of people who want to go out and compare one country to another or one region of a country to another. I will admit this is not my primary area of expertise. I've taken courses on it and done my requisite graduate work on it and all those things, but I'm not what I would call a comparative researcher. But one comparative researcher decided to categorize kind of the different kinds of comparative researchers. And these aren't necessarily all from criminal justice. As we'll see in the next few slides, there are other kinds of science that use essentially these same methods. But first off on the list are the refugees, i.e. somebody who used to be from country A, now they've moved to country B, and they can help the academic community of country B understand the differences between the criminal justice systems between country A and country B. Okay, there is the rendezvousers, and I had a really difficult time both spelling that and getting my spell check to recognize it. But these are the people from country A who make brief visits to country B to kind of look at and get a better understanding of the similarities and differences. Third on the list are the reformers, i.e. I'm from country A, there's some big problem we have here in country A. Country B recently solved this problem, or they never had the problem in the first place. I want to go there and figure out what they're doing that I can then bring home to hopefully help my country. There's the armchair travelers, which are the people who never really leave home, but they use, back in the day, they would use books or letters or whatever to learn about another country. These days, obviously, you would use the internet. But, it would be like if I was here in the United States and wanted to write a paper on the criminal justice process in Sweden without ever actually going to Sweden or even leaving the United States, just going online, finding data from Sweden, finding people to talk to from Sweden, et cetera, et cetera. And then finally, there's the global theorists. And these are the people who are trying to kind of create or discover ideas and concepts and scientific understanding of kind of humanity as a whole without regard to nationality or race or region or any of those things. And again, these categories, like those in the last slide, should never be taken as pure. There's a lot of aspects of each one of these that every comparative researcher is going to have a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And there's going to be a lot of gray area between these. These are not hard and fast categories, okay? Now, kind of the grandfather, I would say, of academic comparative research is anthropology, right? Anthropology was one of the first big social sciences to get a real academic focus, I guess you could call it. I have a particular spot in my heart for anthropology because when I was an undergraduate student, anthropology was my first college degree. As an undergraduate, I got a BA in anthropology, absolutely loved it, but decided to switch and go into criminal justice. But in anthropology, they have what's called the ethnography. And in very, very, very simplified terms, this is where a person from society A goes to immerse themselves into society B for weeks, months, even years to really learn about what it's like to live in that culture. And it can be everything from, me as an American going to another state in the United States and living with an Amish family, or a family that's in the KKK, or an African American family, to learn about how their society is so different even within the same country. Of course, with anthropology, these ethnologies or ethnographies were usually to some poorer, more what they termed at the time primitive societies, Papua New Guinea, Australian Aborigines, Pacific Islanders, small Asian or African villages, those kind of things. So that's kind of where it came from historically. But these Western researchers would go to these tiny out-of-the-way places all over the world and live with these groups and kind of try to understand their society, not just from statistics like how many people did you arrest? Do you have the death penalty? Do you, how do you deal with inheritance? We don't just want to learn about that from kind of answers to these very basic questions. We really want to live with them and spend time with them and understand not just what happens, but why, right? And over the next 200 years since these ethnographies have started within the field of anthropology, kind of one of the biggest lessons that this has given us, and it's kind of depressing how long it took for us to learn it, is that our way, meaning either the American way or the British way or even in a broader context, the Western European way, is not necessarily the only way, and it's not necessarily the best way either, right? Other people do things differently, and those different ways are often more effective or better or just as good, or however you want to define or kind of look at that. Now, there's a different kind of philosophy within science that's almost as old or just as old. And again, this is a very, very kind of basic overview of this stance. You could have an entire course in just the difference between these kind of philosophical foundations and outlooks on research. But in addition to kind of the ethnographers, there's positivists. And positivists are much more kind of data-driven. They believe that there is some underlying social thing happening, and we as social scientists want to measure it, and we want to study it, and we want to assign numbers to it. If we take number of police on the street and number of automobiles available for theft and time of day and quantify these and get them all ready, we can understand global car theft. And if we define well enough and measure accurately enough, we can find these statistical relationships and understand what it takes for any given country to make this crime problem better and to make this social control aspect easier and to do all these things. But if we just kind of are precise enough with our definitions and our measurements and our very controlled experiments and studies, we can learn more about this and kind of solve problems that way. And again, this is a kind of a fairly simplistic oversimplification. A lot of people I feel are going to be screaming at their monitors right now like, oh, that's oversimplified and there's this. And yes, this is a very quick, easy YouTube video. Again, most of these concepts are going to be broadened upon further study. This is just meant to be kind of the base thing. So, kind of looking at it, what would each of these two kind of camps do? Let's say here in the United States, we have a big problem with drug use, opioid problems in certain parts of the country. What are we going to do? A positivist will say, well, let's look at how other countries that don't have these problems deal with these problems. Let's design a study that looks at sentencing for drug crimes versus, prison sentences versus rehab, length of prison sentence based on, and compare Denmark, the UK, the US, and China. An ethnographer is going to say, look, there's a reason opioids are a problem in the United States, and especially in certain regions of the United States. And those problems that drive the opioid crisis aren't present in Denmark and China and the UK, or they are present, but more or less, or whatever. This cultural issue is different. This social issue is different. The history of this area, the economy is all these different aspects are going to be totally different. And it's important to understand that, but you can't necessarily say this program that works in Portugal is going to work the same way in the United States. Now, being too hardcore into either one of these camps is dangerous, because the ethnographer side, the side that just wants to kind of study context and social organizations and political and religious history and looking at all these things, they're kind of constantly, many of them, constantly seduced by the new and exotic, right? Once we start to understand something, it looks better to go off and try something new, right? And that can kind of lead to a lack of complete understanding of the last one you were looking at. The positivist is going to completely ignore a lot of understanding that they could develop if they kind of knew the culture more, knew the kind of things that you can't really measure directly. What is the difference between, the social context of Portugal and the United States? Not only that, but what's the difference between, the social, historical, cultural aspects that are driving the opioid crisis in West Virginia versus Western California, right? These things, if you only look at it from a positivist perspective, can really kind of skew your understanding of what's actually going on. Now, there are different ways to do comparative research, okay? Some of the ways are easier, some of them are more difficult, some of them are good to answer one type of question, some of them are good to answer other types of questions. But there's lots of different methods, and we're going to talk about a few of them. This is not an exhaustive list. But the first one we're going to talk about is case studies, right? Now, a case study is just when you kind of take one state or one region or one country or one area and take a deep dive into how they do it, what they do right, what they do wrong, and just kind of really look at that region, area, state, country, whatever. But these can be useful, even though there's not a lot of comparison going on here. These can be very, very useful in a lot of ways. So one of the important things you got to start with is to justify your choice. Why that area? Why that region? Why the Northeast United States versus the Southeast United States? Why the UK versus why the UK instead of the US? Why Tennessee and not West Virginia? You have to justify your choice somehow. And one of the ways you can do that is to look for one of these kinds of cases, okay? There's the representative case. And this is the case where you can say, look, there's lots of countries or states or areas that do it this way. This one is very, very typical of how those other groups, those other states or those other countries do it. So we're going to take a deep dive into this one, and that will give you some understanding of all those other ones for which this is the representative case, right? So you could say of all the adversarial common law systems, we're going to talk about the United States because they're a very representative case when it comes to other common law and adversarial systems. There's obviously going to be a lot of differences, but if you want to understand the basic gist of an adversarial system, you can understand a lot of that through studying the United States legal system. Then there's the prototypical case, which is this country is one of the first to do these, and we think this country or region or state is going to be, what they've done is going to be the norm soon. So we think physician-assisted suicide is going to become more and more popular throughout the world. So we found a country that did it early, and we're going to talk about how they do it and what the legal safeguards are and what the ethics boards are saying, all these things. We're going to find that kind of first country that first started to push forth that thing, and we're going to study that so we can understand kind of how other countries are probably going to be doing it in the future. Internet regulation. We're going to study how this country started internet regulation and really had some both technical and legal advances or changes to make it harder to post kiddie porn on the internet. A deviant case is these guys do it really differently. We want to study how they do it differently, why they do it differently, what is it that makes them different from everybody else. That's the deviant case, right? And you can learn a lot by looking at, wow, these guys, there's this huge cluster of all these countries or all these states or all these regions that do it this way, but then off in the corner here is this other country. Why? What makes them different? Why do they have so much more auto theft? Or why do they have so much less homicide? Or why do they have so much more people in prison or less sexual assault or whatever? Why are they so different than most other people? That's the deviant case. And then there's the archetypal case. And this is very similar to the prototypical case, but looking back in time rather than forward in time. So the archetypal case would be, if we want to know about common law legal systems, the archetypal case would be the UK. They developed the system. They were the first. They're the ones that spread it all over the place. So we're going to look at them as the archetypal case for common law to understand other common law countries. Now, in the another way to do a comparative study is to do a focused comparison. This is where you take more than one state or region or country and compare them. Sometimes it's 2, sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 10, whatever. But you're going to do a focused comparison of, say, Australia versus New Zealand. And we're going to compare their systems and how they're similar and how they're different. And we're going to say, their history, this was different between the two, and this was the same, and that's why they resulted in these similarities and these differences. And when you do a focused comparison, sometimes you want to find a situation like Australia and New Zealand where they're relatively similar. They're very, very similar. They have similar histories, similar Aboriginal history and colonization, and they were both colonized by the United Kingdom, and so those are two very, very similar countries geographically, socially, culturally, history. Obviously, very different. I'm not trying to say they're, very, very similar. I'm talking from a criminal justice context. They're very similar. But you also might want to do a focused comparison where you take two countries that are wildly different, like the United States and China, or Zimbabwe and the Philippines, or something. Like, they're very, very, very different. But that can be a lot more difficult than doing similar countries, just because, they have, especially if you're doing, say, my country and a country that's very different from mine. So like as an American from the United States, if I was to do a focus comparison between the United States and China on cybercrime issues, I'm going to be very unfamiliar with Chinese culture, Chinese traditions, Chinese history. I don't speak the language. And it's going to be it's going to be much more difficult for me to get access to information and resources in China than it would be for me to get access and resources in the United States. Now, statistical analysis. This is where we get a lot of the positivists, a lot of the quantitative analysts, the big numbers people. This is what we take lots of countries, say every country in Western Europe, or every English-speaking country, or every first world country, or however you want to do it. We can take these large groups and look at, say, auto theft and number of police on patrol, or we're going to take the 100 largest cities in the United States and Canada and look at gun crime and gun control laws. But essentially, you're just finding some kind of quantitative data, putting it in a statistical analysis program, and seeing kind of what the math says, comparing 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different variables. You've got to be careful with this because you can fairly easily fall into the trap of correlation being causation. So correlation just means as X changes, Y changes, right? And sometimes that will be causal. X causes Y. That's why if you increase X, Y increases or decreases or whatever. Something happens to Y when you change X. But it's not necessarily causation. Just because X changes doesn't necessarily mean that it's causing the change in Y. You can have increased ice cream consumption and increase assault rates. So when ice cream consumption goes up or down, assault rates also go up and down at the same time. That's not because ice cream causes people to want to punch other people. That's because ice cream and assault are both get higher when the weather's good, when the weather's warm. When the weather gets cold and dreary, you don't want to eat ice cream. You don't want to go out and put yourself in a position where you're going to get assaulted. So correlation is required for causation, but it's not enough on its own. Just because you found a correlation doesn't necessarily mean it's causal, right? When you get a lot of these statistical analyses done, you can do what's called a meta-analysis. And there are some researchers that just focus on these, and they're usually really big, really high quality scientific content, where you can take the data from lots of different studies, put it all together into essentially one big study, right? The data on the same subject that 10 different researchers collected over this time and over this space, we're going to take all 10 of those, put them all together, and look at the big picture that includes all 10 of those. Now, here's one example of a way to do comparative research, okay? Again, this is just a very simple way to look at this very small technique for comparative research, but it's fairly common for comparative researchers to do prison visits, right? I want to study the criminal justice system in Indonesia. I'm going to go visit Indonesia, go to a prison, see how many prisoners they have, what their quality of life looks like, are they overcrowded or undercrowded, are they getting good education systems, all these things I want to see firsthand, right? But these can be problematic, right? First off, your choice of prison, right? Sometimes it's not your choice. You call the country or the U.S. ambassador or whoever you're going to talk to, and say, hey, I want to go to a prison in this country. And that country might be like, well, we'll let them go to this prison because it's brand new and it looks really good and it's kind of putting our best foot forward. The normal prison life in this country is nothing like that, but we want reality to seem better than it really is, right? So we're going to kind of take them to this prison, which is much newer, much less crowded, much less problematic than it is in other prisons within the same region or the same country or the same state or whatever. Then you really have to worry about, which prisoners and which staff are you going to interview. Like, you're going to sit down and talk to people, right? You want to talk to prisoners, you want to talk to prison guards and stuff. And again, usually you as the researcher are not the one that gets to pick which ones you talk to. So you're going to have to kind of figure out, are these inmates that I'm interviewing kind of typical, or are they special? Are they the smartest? Are they the ones in there for the least serious crimes? Are they have they been paid or threatened to say good things? Same with staff, right? Are these examples that I'm being fed, are they typical or are they different somehow? And then think about things like what can be hidden and what can't, right? Within any given prison, it might be really difficult to hide the fact that there's no running water, right? So if there's only one prison in a very small country and it doesn't have running water, it's not like they can hide that, right? But other things can be hidden. If I'm only shown certain areas of the prison, I might not see the area which has crumbling walls and fungus all over the walls, and where there is no running water in that small part of it, but there is in this other part, So you have to really kind of determine for yourself and really look at and factor into your analysis what could have been hidden and what couldn't be hidden. All right, we're going to take a little break, but I'll be back for the next section of section 2 here in a minute.